All right, so thank you again for joining us. We've come together tonight to discuss the Nova Scotia government's consultation on the Coastal Protection Act's regulations. We're hoping that our session tonight is going to give you a solid overview of what is being proposed for those regulations, as well as sharing our thoughts and our concerns. At the end of our session, we're going to be asking you to submit your feedback to the government so they can hear from you about why this act is so important and about how to make it as strong and effective as possible. The deadline for submissions is September 30th, and at the end of the presentation, I will put up the submission information. I want to again let you know this session is being recorded. We're going to put this video up on YouTube after tonight so that folks who couldn't join one of our sessions will have a chance to listen to it as well, and hopefully it will help people, both encouraging them to submit their feedback and answering any questions that they have, because it is fairly complex and ambiguous stuff. And as I say, as we're presenting, feel free to enter your comments or your questions in the chat, and then we will move to those once we're done presenting. My name is Nancy Anningston. I'm the Coastal Adaptation Senior Coordinator with the Ecology Action Center. I'm on the coastal team. The Ecology Action Center is a membership-based environmental charity, and we're currently celebrating 50 years of offering leadership on critical issues from biodiversity to climate change and environmental justice. I'm pleased to be presenting tonight with my colleague Mike Kofall of East Coast Environmental Law. Mike graduated from the Schulich School of Law in 2017 with 2 certificates of specialization in environmental and marine law. Mike is the staff lawyer at East Coast Environmental Law, and his work often focuses on issues related to coastal and marine environments. East Coast Environmental Law is an environmental charity working to educate the public about environmental laws and advocating for fair environmental laws in Atlantic Canada. Hi, Mike.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. Happy Election Day.
Before we get started, we'd like to acknowledge that we're gathering virtually tonight on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Mi'kmaq people. These lands are governed by peace and friendship treaties, and we are all treaty people. As we discuss important environmental issues today, we'd like to acknowledge that the Mi'kmaq people are the original stewards and knowledge holders, protecting and respecting our environment. For our agenda tonight, I'm going to provide a very quick reminder about why the Coastal Protection Act is so important in Nova Scotia. Then I'm going to turn over to Mike, who's going to give us an overview of the Act and summarizing how the regulation consultation documents outline how the Act will work. And then Mike and I are going to give you a little summary of some of the things we like about the regulations and some of the areas that we're concerned about. And then we're going to turn over for a question and answer and discussion time with you. And as we wrap up, we will be encouraging you to submit your feedback to the government on this important matter. So I am going to make sure everyone's in. And now I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to show some examples of why we need a good, strong Coastal Protection Act. Just a quick reminder of the situation here in Canada's ocean playground. So as you all know, we now have a new provincial government, and it is not the government that initially pledged to create a Coastal Protection Act. So Mike and I have been working on the Coastal Protection Act. This picture is from back in 2018. We've been working on it for what we consider a long time, but we know that our organizations and that many committed coastal folks in Nova Scotia have been working on getting coastal protection legislation in place for a lot longer than that. And even the Act itself, the Act went into the legislature and received royal assent in April of 2019, which is 2.5 years ago, and yet we still don't have an Act in force. And we are here in Nova Scotia with 13,300 kilometers of coastline and about 70% of our population living in coastal communities. We sit on the path of post-tropical storms and hurricanes. In the winter, we usually experience several significant nor'easter storms, which cause tremendous damage along our coast. On the Bay of Fundy shore, we have the highest tides in the world. And Nova Scotia is experiencing the greatest local sea level rise amounts in Canada. As the water is rising, our land in Nova Scotia and in Atlantic Canada is actually subsiding due to something called vertical land movement or isostatic adjustment. So as you can see from the map of Canada underneath here, all the red dots are, almost all the red dots are sitting more squarely on Nova Scotia and our Atlantic partners. And so we have a very severe situation ahead of us, and we're starting to see it now in coastal climate change. Some of the things that we're seeing in Nova Scotia include coastal flooding and storm surge. This is Liverpool back in Hurricane Dorian in 2019. We're seeing inundation, so that's that new permanent sea level, which is affecting structures that are in low-lying areas close to the coast. We're seeing accelerated erosion, and again, this is a property before and after Hurricane Dorian back in September 2019. They lost in some areas 15 feet of land. And then here are a few examples of why we absolutely need an act to govern and regulate and do a better job of forcing developers and people who own property and wish to build along the coast to put their homes set safely back and safely elevated from the coastline to protect our sensitive coastal ecosystems, which are trying madly to adapt in the face of coastal climate change, and to keep people and places safe. And these images are all from the last couple of years. This one here was just built in Halifax municipality just over the winter. This is another one that was just built in the past year in Halifax municipality. This is a structure that was one of the ones that first tipped me off to the problem of undersized lots in Halifax, and this is from 2018. And this is a beautiful coastal wetland in a cove that this work began last November and is currently stalled because of a vigilant and very proactive concerned coastal citizen who has the Department of Environment considering it. But this is a place where nothing should be built. No septic should go in here and no homes should be here. It should be a vibrant coastal wetland. And unfortunately it is not. And then this last one is from Halifax municipality again. This is the view from the western side of the structure. The structure is currently being completed on its interior, so it's freshly built. And this is the northern or the eastern side of the structure. You can see it's not elevated at all and not safely set back at all from the coast. So, there's a really good reason that we need the act. And one of the things we want to compel as we move to the nuts and bolts, one of the things we're really trying to impress upon you this evening is if you are on the fence at all about giving your feedback, if you say nothing else except to say to this new government how much we need this act, I would implore you to do that. So now I'm going to turn over to Mike. And Mike's going to give us his overview of the Coastal Protection Act regulations.
Hello, everyone. Can everyone see that? Or Nancy, at least? If you let me, oh, perfect. All right, I'm just gonna. All right, so I'm gonna talk a little bit, oh, I see admittance here. I'm gonna talk a little bit about the Coastal Protection Act and also the regulations that have been proposed under the Act. And specifically, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Coastal Protection Zone, which is kind of a fundamental part of the Act. I'm going to talk a little bit about building setbacks in the Coastal Protection Zone. And I'm also going to talk a little bit, very briefly, about coastal ecosystem protections in the Coastal Protection Zone. So what does the Coastal Protection Act actually do? Well, there's kind of two things that it does. It protects the environment, so coastal ecosystems specifically, from development and activity created by humans to help protect the dynamic and shifting nature of the coast. And it also protects human developments and activities from risks that Nancy had mentioned, like sea level rise, storm surges, coastal erosion, and coastal flooding. There's also a principle section in the Coastal Protection Act, and I would recommend people go check that out. I'm not going to go too much into detail on it, but it really does set out some really key concepts and codifies them within the Coastal Protection Zone and they do help to guide in the interpretation of the act and also potentially the proposed regulations. And some of the really key principles, there's 7 altogether, but some of the principles are that preservation of the dynamic nature of our coast is actually really important to protecting the coast and ecosystems there, and that coastal features like beaches, dune systems, and coastal wetlands are actually really important ecological functions and are important for our health. And the proposed regulations under the CPA, under the Coastal Protection Act, will actually help to guide and clarify how the act will actually operate. So it'll actually set out a lot of the details. So some of the kind of 3 criteria or 3 things that it does is set out the boundaries of a coastal protection zone, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. It actually sets out the criteria and the details around building setbacks that apply within the coastal protection zone. And it also sets out various requirements and qualifications for designated professionals and the role of municipalities within this regime under the Coastal Protection Act. So the Coastal Protection Zone is kind of the fundamental first step of the Coastal Protection Act and its regulations. And that's because it creates the zone around Nova Scotia's entire coast where the act and the regulations actually apply. And within that zone, there'll be restrictions, prohibitions, and regulation of development and other activities. There's 2 parts of the coastal protection zone, and they're both measured from the ordinary high water mark. And that diagram from the Department of Environment kind of sets out how that works. But basically, from the ordinary high water mark seaward all the way to the edge of the province's jurisdiction is the seaward component. And then there's, from the ordinary high water mark inland, is the second portion of the coastal protection zone. The inland portion of the coastal protection zone will actually be currently proposed to be 80 to 100 meters. And that's in a straight horizontal line from the high water mark. The coastal protection zone that portion could be more than 80, less than 80 meters. It could be more than 100. We're really not sure exactly. That's kind of what's being proposed right now. And that will basically be a consistent strip all the way around the coast, except for kind of 2 modifications that we're aware of that have been proposed. And those are for really important ecosystem features, and specifically barrier beaches and estuaries. So in the case of a barrier beach, which is this photo is actually of a barrier beach in Nova Scotia, normally the Coastal Protection Act would basically run along that strip of sand, that beach, and just continue along the coast from one side of the beach to the other and just keep going. But that's actually a really sensitive area within the coastal kind of zone, because barrier beaches are really prone to breaches or breaking or erosion. And at some point in the near future, probably sooner than later, that pond, that lake, could actually end up being open ocean. And so to help protect against human development in kind of behind that strip, along that land, kind of along that lake, the pond or lake behind a barrier beach, there will actually be a modification to the coastal protection zone. So it'll actually apply to that land around that pond or that lake. And then the other modification of the coastal protection zone boundaries are in estuaries. And an estuary is basically where saltwater and freshwater mix. So you can think of like a river meeting the sea as an example. And under the Coastal Protection Act, that area, that water area, will also be part of the coastal protection zone. And the province has kind of proposed 2 different ways of determining at what point the coastal protection zone will end in that estuary. The first is simply the width of the estuary. So if a river gets narrower and narrower, at some point it's going to meet a width that the province determines that it'll no longer be the coastal protection zone. We don't know what that width is yet. The province hasn't told us. And in the second instance, it will be where the stream or the water course actually meets an existing municipal bylaw that actually includes vertical setbacks that take into consideration sea level rise, floodplaining, and are consistent with the statement of provincial interest on flooding. So those 2 modifications are for the coastal protection zone. Everywhere else, it will be that kind of consistent strip around the coast. And that's really important because, as I said, everything under the Coastal Protection Act and the regulations basically only applies in there. And 2 of the really big kind of protections, the key protections under the Act, are building setbacks. So a minimum building elevation and horizontal building setback. The minimum building elevation so under the province will divide the whole coastline into sections or segments, and each segment of the coast will have its own building elevation, and the province will determine those based on kind of the local circumstances in that area. So is it granite rock, or is there silt and sand, and is there more risk of erosion? And then the horizontal building setback will apply to specific sites. So each site, each development will have a specific horizontal building setback that will be determined by designated professional. So who are the designated professionals? Well, the regulations kind of tell us who is qualified to be a designated professional, and it'll be people or professions like engineers and geoscientists. And the regulations also provide information about what the designated professionals actually do. And so the designated professional will basically go onto a piece of property. They'll take all kinds of different measurements, like the slope, what kind of sediment there is, the grade, except, and all kinds of other measurements that the province will dictate. They'll plug that all into a risk assessment methodology, or they were calling it a risk assessment matrix, and that'll automatically produce a objective horizontal setback for that specific site. And then the designated professional will take all that information and make a designated professional report, and then give it back to the property owner. And then the property owner will take that report and submit it as part of the application process for a building permit or a development agreement, and give it to the municipality. And so municipalities actually play a crucial role under the CPA and the regulations, because they're actually responsible for ensuring that building permits or development agreements comply with the Act and the regulations. And they do that by taking the application and looking at the designated professional report and making sure that the designated professional actually is a designated professional, that all the criteria under the regulations have been met. And then they'll also be responsible for ensuring compliance by monitoring that. So once they give say a building permit, they'll then have to monitor through the same process that they would under the current process. So just very briefly, if someone wants to build in the coastal protection zone, which runs all the way around the coast, they'll have to meet all of the minimum setbacks. So they'll have a minimum building elevation, which is predetermined for the region, and they'll have to hire at their own expense a designated professional to actually do the assessment and produce a report. They'll then give that report to the municipality as part of the permitting process, and then the municipality is responsible for monitoring and compliance, probably through the process by doing inspections, building inspections. And if someone builds in that coastal protection zone and doesn't meet the requirements, either of the designated professional report or completely neglects that process, then they contravene the Act, and that is an offense. There are a couple of exceptions and modifications to the building setbacks in the coastal protection zone. So under the Act and the regulations will only apply to new builds once the Act comes into force, and the Act is currently not in force yet. And it also will be exempt. The other exemption under the Act is public infrastructure and commercial and industrial structures that actually need access to the water below the high water mark, with the caveat that they still have to try as reasonably as possible to adhere to the Act and the principles that I mentioned. And then there's some exemptions and modifications under the proposed regulations, which you can still provide feedback, and I would encourage you to provide feedback. There's some listed here, including mobile trailers and mobile homes designed for frequent transport, storage buildings along the coast like boathouses, and then things like decks and gazebos. And there's also a modified requirement for developed downtown waterfronts. And developed downtown waterfronts, there's actually a definition in the proposed regulations, which is that they are areas that are dominated by mixed-use structures with a public amenity or multi-unit residential component, and that there's no gaps between those buildings of more than 75 meters. And in those circumstances, for those developed downtown waterfronts, the horizontal setback will not apply, which means that the person developing will not have to get a designated professional report, but they will still need to meet the minimum building elevation in that section of the coast. And then just briefly talking about ecosystem protections, I've already kind of mentioned two, which are that in the coastal protection zone, there are modifications of the boundaries of the coastal protection zone in barrier beaches and estuaries. Under the Coastal Protection Zone, under the Coastal Protection Act, there's also a specific section, Section 11, that prohibits alteration of wetlands within the Coastal Protection Zone. That's a new protection. That's an addition to other protections currently in other laws. And then the regulations also provide some additional protections potentially to ecosystems. And some of those include prohibiting infilling on Crown land or on beaches designated under the Beaches Act. And also the prohibition of installation of shoreline stabilization structures like shoreline armoring on Crown land below the high water mark. So there are some additional protections in that regard. I'm going to turn it back over to Nancy once I finish sharing my screen here.
Thank you, Mike. So I'm just going to put up a couple more slides and we're going to give you just a brief summary. So I'd ask you to stay on mute for a few more minutes. We're going to give you a summary of what we like and what we don't like about the Act. I'm just going to share my slides here. Okay. Okay, so what we like in summary, and this is a very quick summary, I mean, the Act is really important. It's really sorely needed. So the fact that it's going to be a Coastal Protection Act to restrict development is really essential. We really like the fact that they're using a range, an estimated range of between 80 and 100 meters for the Coastal Protection Zone. We want it to be 100 meters, and we'll be asking for that in our feedback. But that's a robust coastal protection zone. We like that there's evidence of diligence in the risk assessment measures, things like taking 80 years of sea level rise and flooding into consideration. And we like the approach. The way they've done this in some ways is very pragmatic. We have a really diverse coastline. It's not the same as the coastline of Prince Edward Island, where it's fairly consistent coastal geomorphology all along our shore. We've got granite outcroppings, sandy eroding slopes, low-lying barrier beaches, estuaries. We've got a very diverse coastline. And so this somewhat customized way of assessing building applications along our varied coastline with the designated professional and that blanket zone, we think is an interesting and good approach. So what we're going to do is divide up the things we're concerned about here. So I'm going to speak to the first couple and then Mike's going to speak to the next couple. So, I mean, as someone said it when we were just sort of warming up to go into the session, really we're not looking at drafted regulations here. So there is a fair amount of ambiguousness and we're having to make a lot of assumptions. But based on our assumptions and the questions we've been able to ask Nova Scotia Environment, I am deeply concerned about the fact that septic, which is regulated by Nova Scotia Environment, does not appear that they will be embracing or taking into consideration this notion of a coastal protection zone. They're going to continue issuing septic permits using the same rules and regulations they're using now. And to me, that makes no sense at all. This is a provincial act coming out of Nova Scotia Environment to be administered at a municipal level, and yet those septic permits are coming out of Nova Scotia Environment at a provincial level. And we've seen tons of cases where there's a real disconnect in the information that's submitted for the septic permit and the information that's submitted for the building permit. So to me, it's a deal breaker. I really want the septic to also be considering a coastal protection zone. It makes no sense for us to go to all this work to move structures back to protect sensitive ecosystems and have septic too close and have septic breaching and contaminating coves and so on. So that's something we're going to be pushing really hard for. It bothers me that the working waterfronts are treated differently. Like, this makes no sense to me. The whole point of this act in addition to protecting coastal ecosystems, is to stop us from building in dangerous and risky places in the face of the extreme coastal climate change that we anticipate we will be facing for the next hundreds and beyond years. Why we're making all of these sort of restrictions and rules to set back and elevate residential structures, and then allowing, condo developments to be built right on the waterfront and infilling out onto the waterfront and so on. It makes no sense. Really, we should be applying it to everything. So I will be saying that in the Ecology Action Center submission. And something that I see a lot in my work, often people are calling or emailing in with coastal community inquiries. We seem to rely really heavily on a watchdog system where citizens have to report other citizens for coastal issues. And that is already a huge problem. It's not working well. And now we're putting in a much heavier set of regulations, which will hopefully, stop people from building in dangerous places, but they're only going to stop them if our enforcement is more effective. And we're not seeing sufficient evidence that enforcement will be more effective. And then Mike, I'll turn over to you for the rest of the things we are concerned about.
Yeah, and I guess these are probably highlights more than all the key things, but maybe not all the kind of nuances. And just kind of continuing off of what Nancy said about enforcement difficulty, is really the lack of transparency. And as I mentioned, really this whole process is predicated on the provincial permitting process for developments. So that means that in order to ensure enforcement, and especially in Nova Scotia, a lot of that kind of monitoring ends up falling onto average citizens. If you don't have a building permit or a development agreement, you don't know what's in that. You don't know what the conditions are, what the designated professionals report said. You're going to have no idea what the actual setback for a specific development needs to be, the horizontal setback, which is set out in that report. And therefore, if we don't have access to those, it's going to be really hard to make sure that we enforce effectively under the Act. And kind of related to that is the high water mark. And we're going to need, as I mentioned this kind of in my slides, the coastal protection zone and the boundaries, both the seaward portion and the landward portion, are all predicated on that high water mark. So where's that high water mark is going to be a key question to determining where is the upland boundary and whether or not you're in the coastal protection zone, whether or not you are in the correct area for your horizontal setback. And so right now, as a process under the province, it's really hard to know how to determine the high water mark. There's a definition in the Land Surveyors Act that actually sets out what the high water mark is. And that definition, more or less, and this is in lots of different jurisdictions, but it's the medium high tide line between spring and neap tides. And I don't know about anyone else, but I would have a really hard time based on that definition going onto a piece of land, on a piece of coastland, and determining just on the spot what the high water mark is, and then basing everything else on that high water mark. Under the proposed regulations, under the Coastal Protection Act and kind of the general regime, we don't really have a good concept of how they're going to measure the high water mark. And so one of the things we're suggesting, and we will suggest to the province, is that there needs to be a really clear method of determining the high water mark, whether it's a guide or a policy or it's set out right in the regulation, because it's going to determine how everything else works. And then the last 2 points are kind of connected, but we're really worried about exemptions. So it's already pretty narrowly focused act and regulations, and there's lots of exemptions. And some of those are silent and some of those are written. So Nancy already talked about one specific kind of silent exemption, and that's septic. And septic is going to be exempt because there's nothing that talks about septic in the act or the regulations. And septic doesn't require a building permit or a development permit. It actually requires an approval from the Department of Environment and Climate Change. So it's not going to be captured under this regime. There's all kinds of other exemptions. For example, golf courses, playgrounds, parking lots, those sorts of things are all going to be exempt because the Act and the regulations, or the proposed regulations, they just don't talk about those things. Under the Act itself, there is some prohibitions I mentioned on infilling and on shoreline stabilization structures, including shoreline armoring. But those only apply to crown land below the high water mark. So everything above the high water mark, generally private land, it's not going to apply to those at all. And then there's one other exemption that's actually written out in the proposed regulations currently, and that is actually for mobile or trailer homes that are designed for frequent transport. We think that's problematic specifically because I can take an RV right now, I can go and rent an RV, and if I have a piece of private land on the coast, I can go and park the RV there for the weekend and then return it, and it's all fine and dandy. But I can do the same thing with an RV that I own. It's made for frequent travel. I can park it there on my private piece of land and just leave it there forever. And under the regulations as proposed, that's fine and dandy. I don't need a permit to do that, a building permit, and the regulations won't capture that. So it basically defeats the point of protecting people and protecting people's health from things like climate change, induced sea level rise, coastal erosion, storm surge, because I can go do that and put that place where I live right on the coast. So that, and usually those things are also accompanied by septic systems, which are also exempt. So it's kind of this compounding issue. Nancy, I think I'm going to turn it back to you for closing remarks.
Okay, so one sort of as an overall summary, and we've started to receive a fair amount of feedback. We've had a couple of these sessions. I would say overall, there seems to be a strong sense from the folks we're talking to that they're feeling like this act is all about buildings and it doesn't seem to be fulfilling the promise, or these regulations potentially, that it doesn't seem to be fulfilling that important pledge of the act that's to protect the coastal ecosystems and protect the environment. So, in our comments, we're definitely going to be emphasizing and reminding government that one of the most important aspects of this act is that in the face of coastal climate change, we need our coastal ecosystems to be strong and resilient and dynamic. And in order to do that, we really need to be protecting them. Now I'm going to put this feedback slide up again at the end of our session today and in about 20 some minutes. So I want to put it up now so you can see it. You can send your feedback to government. You have until September 30th, and you can send it by email or you can send it by mail, and that's the address there. Now I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to stop the recording.